Sally. We just got the mail. Thank you. With a great question from Bonsai Empire. This is fairly involved. The question is, what are the top 10 things that we used to do in bonsai but have since learned better? Or, in a slightly different vein, what are the things that John Naka was wrong about? And this question is from the USA. And I personally think John Naka did a great job with the information he had at the time. We have to remember that this is 30, 40 years ago. And also tastes have changed significantly in the last 30, 40 years. Our technical quiver is entirely different. Our aesthetic expectations are very different. How we manipulate energy in a tree has changed a lot. So my answers to this great question will be related to both those two things, both the aesthetic and the technical. So one of the things that has changed in the last few decades is our understanding about how to manage junipers. When I learned bonsai, I was taught that we pinch junipers, and you grab a tuft of foliage and you pinch all of the growing tips on it. My junipers were always really weak, and it wasn't really until I got to Japan that I learned that really isn't done. You let that shoot grow out. If there's a cloud of foliage, there'll be several shoots. We're talking about a shimpaku, for instance. There'll be several shoots that charge off with a much greater energy. Those are the ones that you come in with scissors after you've let them grow a little bit. And then you come in with the scissors and you cut them a little bit inside the foliage pad so you don't really see the cut. You can't really pinch something that's that long. It's a bit lignified. So that's now our understanding of how to work with junipers. You leave everything else alone, all the other little tips alone. The juniper needs the energy from the tips in order to maintain energy. Now on to the next. So one thing that we understand a little bit differently these days is, and I learned this back when, which is branch placement, where the branches come from. So the branch is supposed to come off on the right or the left side, and then the next branch comes off on the other side, and then there's a back branch. And there's certain situations where this isn't very helpful. For instance, with a yamadori, you very rarely have those sorts of possibilities. So you end up placing the branches where they need to be as opposed to where they arise from. So that's a significant change in our understanding of how you work on trees, particularly old trees. That guideline just doesn't really work. So another concept which has shifted in recent years is the idea of how we use fertilizer. So if you don't reduce fertilizer, you're going to end up with a very youthful plant. No matter how old the tree actually is, it's going to begin to look youthful. So you're going to have a big leaf, and you're going to have a fat twig, and you might even begin to lose bark. But you aren't going to be able to get some of these refined characteristics that, on a small scale, look as though the tree has a certain perspective and also a great age. So by limiting fertilizer, rather than sort of limiting water, which is a very dangerous technique, if you switch that to being able to control very precisely your fertilizing levels, then you can easily program different trees to do different things. And then this is segueing into other parts of an answer here, where we begin to talk about soils, where one thing in the past that we've used a lot in the West is organic soils. Now, organic soils are great when you have a young plant. And you're trying to go for girth, and you're trying to develop your branching and all that. Maybe the tree is 5 years old and you have it in a 5-gallon bucket or something like that. And you can really push a tree fast using some organic because it holds onto a lot of water and holds onto a lot of fertilizer. But once you get this tree into a bonsai pot and you begin to try and create fine ramification, you're going to really struggle. And this is why organic soils can grow a pretty good tree. The problem is it's often too strong a tree. And we have no control, or the pinpoint kind of control that we want over watering and over fertilizing to be able to affect some of these diminution effects in the leaves and very thin twigs. So that's another thing that the West at least has kind of woken up to, I believe, is to shift to volcanic soils that don't hold on to a lot of fertilizer, and that we can really pinpoint our watering schedule with. And that will allow us to make very refined trees. So one other thing that we have shifted our thoughts about on is the soil component of sharp sand. This is something that was floating around in the myriad bonsai publications years ago. Now this isn't something that there seemed to be much evidence about. If you grow a plant in sand, in just pure sand, it will have one of the worst thready root systems you can find. The best fine root growth is in the volcanic mixes. Even organic mixes do better than sharp sand. So sharp sand was an additive to other things, but it's kind of it doesn't do anything. It doesn't absorb anything. It doesn't release anything. And the structure of the particle isn't nearly as useful as something like lava or pumice, which has a very different rough kind of characteristic, as well as giving and receiving hydration. And those particles, not surprisingly, create much finer root growth, which then translate into finer top growth. Another one that I remember from long ago, I remember being told this, is that if you leave wire on your tree in the wintertime, that branch will die. I'm not sure where I left that one behind. I think it was probably when I was studying in the States, but in Japan, I'll just give you a few examples from Japan. I remember several trees which were very old conifers, and the metabolism of these trees had slowed down so far that the wire on them had been left on for 5 or 6 years. That's how slowly the branches were actually expanding in size. The cambium layer was building wood so slowly that the wire was left on as long as it wasn't biting in. So obviously it went through that many winters. So it's not a cold issue, really. I think this whole idea probably came about when somebody put wire on and then bent a branch, and then there was a crack there, and then it dehydrated, and then that branch died. I have a feeling that's probably where this misunderstanding came from. But wire on a branch through the winter will not in and of itself cause a problem. So if you look at books from 30, 40 years ago, you see a lot of these very tall, skinny cascade pots. It was thought that this mass would balance the mass of this full cascade tree. If you look at books from today, from Japan at any rate, you will find that these pots are almost in complete disuse. You almost never see them. There's a couple reasons for this. For one thing, it's very hard to keep your tree happy in a very tall, skinny pot with a very small surface area at the top. Your watering is kind of tricky, your fertilizing is a little tricky. The root zone here has lots of different zones to it, for good or bad. Your drainage can, if that one hole is blocked up on the bottom, it can be a bit of a problem. So these days, just for horticultural reasons, your semi-cascade and full cascade trees are usually seen in semi-cascade pots. These are kind of squarish dimension pots. Not that they can be round, but I mean just looking at it from the front. So that's been quite a big shift. Is away from these tall, skinny pots, and that's a shift that has made a lot of sense just for tree health. So here's an aesthetic one. So it hinges on some on horticultural things as well. But back in the day, now this wasn't too long ago. It's maybe 30 years ago. Even in Japan, you could see bonsai that were placed in the pot. So the nabari of the tree, placed in the pot very far over to one side. It's probably 1/3 here, 2/3 over here. And the tree was way over here. Very dramatic, yeah, kind of directional. This is where it's going. It was very, very clear. These days, the tree has a very different orientation. For most trees, say you have just a myogi, or if you have a formal upright or something like that, this tree is placed almost in the center and then just slightly off. Sometimes it's less than an inch. Now that that creates quite a bit more tension in the pot and tree combination. Also, it's better horticulturally for the tree because you're not hedging in one side of the tree. Those roots aren't being cut very severely, and you might have some problems on this side in terms of the branching. You might get some weakness there. So that isn't done so much anymore. Trees are more centrally located and just slightly off. That's a big shift. So our attitudes toward repotting have shifted in the last couple decades. I remember when I was first learning bonsai, bare rooting part of a root ball or all of a root ball was quite common. I remember washing off soil and all this. And unless you have a really young deciduous tree or something, you don't really do that. Certainly not when I was an apprentice in Japan. It was exceedingly rare. It's usually when we expected some kind of root rot or something like that, when we suspected that when we were smelling it, then we would bare root a little area. But otherwise, bare rooting was not done. And so this sort of metabolic stress that was given to a tree every 2 years when I was first learning bonsai ended up in not only dead trees, but trees that were never really able to reach a stability, an area of stability where the top of the tree mirrored the bottom and that there was some kind of continuity there. And the way that the severe kind of repotting techniques that were often used in the West, and unfortunately still are sometimes, really limits what we can do with bonsai. One of our largest sort of broad stroke erroneous beliefs in the West is that the horticulture of a geranium translates into the horticulture of bonsai, and it doesn't. We're tenacious about giving that up, but really our goals are so different. You know, if we grow cacti, we have a totally different goal than when we grow a geranium and when we grow an orchid. And from all of those to bonsai, totally different goals. Soils are different in all of those things. If you think about orchid soils, they're very different than what we use in bonsai. If you grow a geranium, entirely different, right? Also cacti. Those are just several examples, but they are based on not only what the tree appreciates or the plant appreciates, but also what you're trying to do with it. So one of the problems with bonsai is that it's in such a small pot. And because it's in a small, often shallow pot, our drainage has to be really, really, really good. Otherwise, we get only root growth along the sides of the pot, which creates huge problems when it comes to heat in the summertime, when it comes to repotting the tree. We're greatly limited what we can do in terms of removing roots. So the soils that we use directly translates into how the tree is going to respond, what kind of a root system it's going to have. And so geranium horticulture does not translate into bonsai horticulture, and we need to really give that idea up.